All right. I think we're going to kick it off, and people will join progressively throughout the call. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the second of a series of social justice conversations. I'm Gideon Reisner. I'm the CEO of Stand Up, Jewish Commitment to a Better World, and we're one of the partners for these conversation events. I want to quickly acknowledge that I'm sitting on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. I want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all Zooming from today, wherever we are around the country. I want to thank the other partner organisations as well. So we've got the Jewish Climate Network, who are creating awareness about and mobilising the Jewish community to act on the climate emergency. We have Launchpad, the hub for innovation for Jewish changemakers, and also Plus 61J, which is seeking to broaden the conversation in the Jewish community. So thank you, everyone. Just a few housekeeping things. Please turn on your videos if you're comfortable. I can see that a lot of you had, which is great, because then it feels like we're not social distancing, we're just physical distancing, and it creates a bit more intimacy. But please stay on mute if you can. Otherwise, it's going to become a bit of a balagan very quickly. I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have some questions, I'll try my best to ask a few. And if you've got any technical issues or something's going wrong, you can write in the chat, but you can also message Gary and Dash, who are both on the call, and they should be able to help you out. We're going to try and conclude the main conversation at 2:50 p.m. And in the final 10 minutes, please stick around and you'll be put into like a little breakout room to discuss the session. I did it last week and I thought it was really great. So if you've got the time just after 2:50, please stick around for a quick conversation with some of our friends here on Zoom. So I'll quickly introduce our two guests and then we'll get into it. So I've got Ronni Kahn AO, who is the CEO and founder of OzHarvest, which is one of Australia's leading food rescue organisations. Her journey in the fight against food waste became the feature of an independent film called Food Fighter last year. And last year she was appointed Officer of the Order of Australia. She's also been a Boss Magazine Top 21 True Leader and was an Australian Local Hero of the Year in 2010. And her bio goes on, but in the interest of time, we'll start to introduce Josh as well, who is Labor's federal MP for Macnamara, which was previously the seat of Melbourne Ports. And Josh was elected in the federal election last year. Josh is the grandson of Jewish migrants. He attended Scopus, with a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in political studies, and worked as a teacher's aide, as a factory hand, and as a senior advisor to Daniel Andrews. And he's a member of the House Standing Committee on Environment and Energy and the chair of the Labor Party's International and Legal Affairs Caucus Committee. So a very warm welcome to our two guests and thank them both so much from what must be very busy schedules to sit down and have a conversation with us. So I might just throw the first broad general question to Ronni, which is just how are you and how is the organisation going at the moment?
So thank you so much for having me. It's such a treat to be with all of you. And yeah, how am I? You know, it is a fascinating time. I think OzHarvest in the last 8 weeks has pivoted, redeployed. We haven't lost a single staff member, which I'm incredibly proud of. And we have received and delivered more food than we have ever in any month since our inception. So that takes a lot of incredible hard work and a lot of nimbleness and agility. And it is a very strange, weird time.
Thank you, Ronni. And Josh, I might just quickly ask you the same question, how you're going and what it's like sort of being a politician at the moment.
Gid, good question. I get to wear a lot more tracksuit pants than I ever did before, which I'm not complaining about. Wearing a suit is not my idea of fun. And before I sort of talk about me, OzHarvest is one of the most brilliant organisations, and they actually have a warehouse or a base in Macnamara in Port Melbourne, which I've been to and met Bernardo and the team. And I'm a big advocate for OzHarvest. They do wonderful work, and Ronni, you should be very, very proud of your organisation. In terms of
people,
incredible, and they're good people. In terms of politics, from the nice to the crazy and to the absurd, Josh Frydenberg this week was meant to be his week where he was going to be the first treasurer in Australia's for the last decade to deliver a surplus. And instead, he delivered the biggest budget deficit in the history of our nation. It is an unpredictable and extraordinary time in Australian politics, and perhaps through no fault of Josh's own circumstances, find the government watching over a piece of history that we all haven't seen before. So I think this is an extraordinary time in politics. It's an extraordinary time in our country, and it's also a rare opportunity where we have a chance to stop and think about what are we doing well, what aren't we doing well, and what sort of Australia do we want to build in the future. So maybe that's what we'll talk about this afternoon.
We've got plenty to get through, Josh. It'd be great if we can get to some of those things as well. But I might throw another question to Ronni. And just a reminder, I am watching the chat. So if anyone has any questions, I'll try and work them in as best I can. I suppose, Ronni, you know, I feel like food has been sort of at the center, or not at the center, but it's been a huge part of the virus. And so I'm really interested to know at what point you sort of realized how serious this crisis was, and sort of what was your first reaction as CEO of a food rescue organization?
Thank you so much. So very briefly, we came out of summer, which was fires and drought. So to start off with, we'd already re-amplified and had changed our model somewhat just to try and deliver on that, but knew that focus was on fires and funding had all been to fires. So coming into March was a difficult time, but for us, a great time, because the end of March is when we hold our major event, the CEO Cook-Off, 2,000 people. It brings us in $3 million. By the second week in March, it became very clear to me, even though the government had not yet stopped public gatherings, that there was no way our event would go ahead. And on the 15th of March, I pulled that event. Which meant literally cutting off a lifeline, but also knew that this was unprecedented times. So I think making decisions fast and being able to act swiftly is a huge part of being a leader during a time that is strange. And I think we all saw that actually, even in our government, they didn't quite get it right in the beginning. They certainly have, but it's really about reacting as quickly as possible. So that quick action was very important. We then cancelled, obviously, all of our face-to-face. We run one of the biggest cooking schools in Australia. We had to cancel all our classes, which meant, again, another loss of revenue of about $2 million. And then we went into the panic buying, which of course had a huge effect, because that meant for the first time ever in 16 years, our suppliers had no food for us. So that was a challenge for us to have to look at our model and say, okay, we're going to have to buy food. We can't rely on rescued food. We've never bought food in 16 years.
That's amazing, especially, I mean, I've got a few questions about that coming up, especially with a $2 million revenue loss. Having to make those two decisions at the same time is really amazing. But we will come back to that. I want to throw to Josh again, because I've been thinking about this quite a lot personally, right at sort of the beginning. It's a bit hard to remember it now because it feels like kind of a year's passed in a few months. But right near the beginning, when the Grand Prix was getting cancelled and we were sort of just coming to the grips with the virus, can you talk about what it was like being a federal politician then? How did you and your office respond to that moment, and how were you engaging with the electorate at that point in time?
Gid, it's a really good question. And Ronni touched on it a little bit, where the panic buying and the people going into the supermarkets, I think really reflected the anxiety that a lot of people were experiencing. You know, I had this sort of a little bit of a disagreement with the Victorian government and certainly the federal government over the Grand Prix, where I made this public statement saying, I'm not going, and I don't think other people should go either. The idea of bringing 70,000 people together in Albert Park while a couple of Italians have got, are coughing and are being checked for coronavirus, who are, a couple of the pit guys, it seemed crazy to me that we were gonna possibly have 70,000 people collecting. And, I made the news because I said, I don't think people should be gathering in that way. It's an entirely unremarkable, it's an entirely unremarkable statement saying that 70,000 people shouldn't be gathering right now. And it's only been just over a month. Our world has turned upside down in a matter of weeks. And, and so to ride that wave was really, I think everyone found it difficult, but certainly from a communications point of view and from a leadership point of view, all I was thinking and a lot of people that I was speaking to were trying to get out was how quickly this is all changing and how quickly our world is changing and how we need to adapt to it. And that was a really, to be honest, mate, it was a really nervous time because a lot of people we'd never seen this before. We'd never seen a pandemic like this before where we needed to act quickly and we needed to act together. And so there wasn't really a rule book. And I have to say the first few weeks there was a lot of heightened anxiety and there was a lot of heightened stress. But I think once that period happened, people were able to sort of collect themselves and find their sort of new normal and build in a new routine. But the honest answer, it was really, really hard.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's been the same. And something you said before, Ron, I've just been thinking about it a little bit. Like, if we're talking about leadership in crisis, simultaneously coming to grips with a $2 million revenue loss and then having to feed people, when I think about stand up and the programs that we do, which are really important, when we have to make quick decisions about them, that can be really hard. But, I know that people, as a result of our decisions for our programs, they're not going to go hungry that night, and so there's that extra layer of urgency, I sort of think, for the work that OzHarvest does. So do you mind trying to dig a little bit deeper about, you're sitting there and you've got to make these huge decisions, $1 million decisions. Can you talk about what it's like as a leader to make those decisions and also with the overlay of having to make them very, very quickly at the same time?
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting during that particular time, my team had agreed and realized we would have to cancel these, but they didn't want me to cancel them then. They wanted the benefit of more days just to fundraise so that we lost less money than the full amount. And, you work closely with a team and you want you to have as much support as possible. But I woke up on that Thursday morning, called the team and said, I have decided. And I guess that's what a leader has to do. And it was the right decision. There's not even any doubt to call that event that day, not wait 4 more days or 5 more days would have made us look, it was the right decision, but it was a very hard one because I was going against my team who really felt that it was going to add to the negativity, to our negative bank balance, which it was going to add anyway. And I just had to make that decision. And it's a hard one, but at some point you realize, well, the buck stops here. And if I'm an intuitive leader, and I knew that I had to do that despite a little bit of anxiety from my team. And it did work out to be the best. There were, that event invites 200 CEOs and 200 business leaders were all committed to being part of that. So then we had to tell them that they weren't, the event wasn't going to take place. And we absolutely thought we'd postpone it till October. Then in that initial comms, we said, we'll hold the event in October. Well, now, if we hold that event, it'll be October 2021. So then the question became, how do you fill the gap? And that's where we're at right now, looking at what is it going to take to find that extra $5 million that was a face-to-face experience and was a very clear framework.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Ronni.
And $5 million means 10 million meals we theoretically can't deliver if we don't get that. But
yeah,
the gaps being filled in different ways.
I mean, that's hard to imagine, but I like what you said about sort of intuitive leadership, and maybe in some ways kind of all the times that leaders have to make decisions in non-crisis periods, maybe like kind of is sort of practice for those crisis moments where you just woke up and you knew what the right thing to do is. And, you know, when Stand Up made the Jewish Response Coronavirus Group, you know, it was sort of, again, it was kind of a bit of an instinctive decision, and actually it was quite a good one. Didn't think it through that much, and it's had a really great effect. So Josh, I'm going to work kind of, Alex Katz has asked sort of a question in here about how do we keep bipartisanship that we've seen during this pandemic beyond this time for the benefit of the country as a whole. And so like maybe to twist that question a little bit, you know, I think you're a leader of the community, you're an elected MP, but you've also got a front row seat to other major leaders as well. You've got, you know, the leader of the opposition and ministers and shadow ministers, and you were in Canberra last week. So do you mind maybe talking about how, you know, maybe some of that bipartisanship, how we keep that, but also what it's been like to be in Parliament at a bipartisan time, watching, you know, as a leader, but also watching other leaders that you work with and you know, that you sometimes spar with on the other side of the chamber?
There's a delicate balance that oppositions have had to strike throughout this pandemic. Some have done it better than others. The Victorian Liberals have done an appalling job at it. Looking at some of the ridiculous name calling and sort of schoolyard politics of Tim Smith and some of the other Victorians who, quite frankly, I just am very grateful that they're not in government right now, and that Daniel Andrews and Brett Sutton are managing it from the Victorian point of view. That's a good example of how to get it wrong. I think you're right that we have approached it slightly differently federally. In that the number one thing that we need to do in this has been about getting through it as a country. So we have to be constructive. Now that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be accountability, and it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be discussions about how to improve public policy. This is the biggest public policy that our country has ever expended, ever. The JobKeeper package is the biggest piece of government expenditure in the history of our nation. That means that we should be looking at ways in which we can improve it. It means that we can be asking serious questions about why the government has chosen to leave off 1 million casual workers throughout this pandemic, why the government has chosen to leave off temporary visa holders, people who are, you know, we saw queues in the first week around Centrelink, and now we're seeing queues around food banks by temporary visa holders who don't have any means by which to support themselves. Now, I don't think that bipartisanship on a policy like that should be lost on that for the sake of arguing, but I do think there is room for scrutiny, and I do think there is room for accountability. And if it's done in a way that's about policy, and if it's done in a way that's genuinely about improving the nature of the government's response, then that's okay, and that's been a good thing. So, look. The honest answer is I don't think we're you know, that this pandemic means that we should give up our democracy. We shouldn't, right? Our democracy is robust, and we should keep our democratic institutions, and we should keep our scrutiny of government. That's really important. But at the same time, you know, there comes a point where it has to be, and especially at the moment, our focus has to be on the policy. It can't be on just name calling and some of the pettiness that we see in other forms of politics. And if we get that balance right, then ultimately we'll get through this pandemic a little bit better.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I might just before throwing back to Ronni again, I might just ask you another question about just focusing again on leadership and politicians. I mean, I'm 28, and I've been watching politics for a little while. And when I was preparing for this, I started to think about other crises that Australia has gone through. And, you know, the ones I thought of, like the bushfires, citizenship crisis, I made a little list here, the blackouts in South Australia, the drought. I mean, I feel like the response by politicians to those crises have been pretty underwhelming. And I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. But I do think that the COVID-19 pandemic has been a little bit different. And I suppose as a politician today, and as, I suppose a new politician, having only been around
1 year
today. A year today. That's right. Yeah. A year today. Yeah. There you go.
Since we lost that bloody election. Yeah.
What do you, and I'm sure you're a student of political history. What do you think the political classes kind of learnt about crisis leadership from Corona, and will this sort of change political leadership going forward?
There's lots in that question, Gid. There's lots in that question. I think one of the best things that Morrison did was set up the National Cabinet. I think that was a way in which you could align different voices from around the country, and essentially from an organisation that was COAG with a new fancy title, which COAG, which is the sort of leaders conference that they hold a couple of times a year, which basically does nothing. The National Cabinet has actually been a really good way in which to bring people from across the political spectrum towards dealing with this crisis. So I think reaching across the political divide in order to unite the country has been a really important thing that perhaps we haven't seen before. And we certainly didn't see it during the bushfires and other crises as well, where, or in, in the blackouts that you mentioned, where political point scoring has been a key part of it. I think that the National Cabinet was a good thing. I do think, though, that I do think that, like, in politics and in government, it's important to it's important to there's an old saying that says you shouldn't waste a crisis, right? It's a good chance to show your leadership and to show what you believe in and your dedication to the role. But I also think that it's not the normal posture for politicians, and things will go back to the way in which they were, and people will revert back to an old way of life. I think Albanese said this a few weeks ago, and I think it's probably one thing that we haven't learned, and this is sort of what I'm worried about when we return back to that posture of sort of politics as usual, is that for the first time, I think, in a long time, we've had public servants, experts, not necessarily politicians, but scientists being a key part of the national debate. Ultimately, communication has been led by Daniel Andrews, Scott Morrison, and other premiers. But we've also had regular briefings from the chief health officers, the chief medical officers, and other scientists. One thing I don't think we can sort of go back to, or we shouldn't go back to, is removing some of those key expert voices mixed in with politician voices. And especially when dealing with, an upcoming challenge like climate change, I think it would be really good to have someone like Ronni Kahn AO as a chief climate officer, or a chief environmental officer, or a renewables, commissioner, or whatever title we want to put in, giving regular briefings to the public about what's going on, what are the capabilities, so that politicians have other voices that can't be completely manipulated by politics. I think that's been something that if we take from this crisis, that we've listened to the scientists now, we should listen to them into the future, and listen to experts more, and had more public expert voices among political voices. That will be a good thing as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we've got a chief scientist in Australia, Alan Finkel. The one time that Alan sort of made a big intervention was in the energy space, and his recommendation, ultimately the major one, wasn't followed. So, it was really interesting when you said, things will go back to normal. I think a lot of people probably don't want things to go back to normal, but maybe having, Alan Finkel and other independent experts doing press conferences every now and then would be quite good. Ronni, there's a question here from Simone about fundraising strategies that you and your team are working on to raise funds. And, again, I keep coming back to this because I think it's really remarkable, sort of that loss, that big decision that you had to make that had huge ramifications for OzHarvest. Can you talk a little bit about, what you're doing now, and how that's affected your team's, I'm not going to say like morale, but how do you pivot in it? Because, you know, you've got to make a huge pivot there, and you've got to bring people along with you. And in this case, it feels like maybe they didn't really agree with your decision. So how do you make that decision, pivot, and then say, okay, now we need to fundraise? And Simone's asking, how are you doing that? So that's probably a two-part question.
Absolutely. Thank you. So the truth is, once the decision was made, we all obviously, you move on and you work with that decision. And it was really just about timing. So that decision would have been made for us by the government. We just chose to make it first. So what we did was we immediately created a Here for Hope campaign. Once we saw what was happening, we put out a campaign which I have to say has been extraordinary, in that if you'd have asked me, and we'd come out of the bushfires and everybody thought all funding is gone, you know, there was so much money raised during bushfires. But the beautiful thing is there actually is an abundance of money, much like there is an abundance of, and it's about tapping into it. And our Here for Hope campaign has been probably one of the best campaigns we've ever run. We launched it within a couple of weeks of COVID, and somehow it has resonated with individuals, with many new donors. So we've reached new people who we might not have, who had never supported us in the past, which is really very gratifying. So that Here for Hope is an ongoing campaign that anybody can donate to. But of course, we've had to look at different strategies, and we again managed, and government funding did come through. I lobbied together with a whole bunch of charities, because initially the charity sector was not part of the economic stimulus. And all we saw was money going to businesses, like whether it was Qantas or all business. But our sector, which is deemed essential, is vital services, was not getting any funding. So our lobbying really worked, which is why our sector did get funding. And I don't just mean the food relief sector, I mean the charity sector, from more funds going to Red Cross Salvos, Uniting Care, to mental, all of those sectors. So there was initial government funding, which helped us enormously, just to literally get through, to go from an organization that was rescuing food to an organization that needed to purchase, because 5 million Australians need food every day. And that was prior to COVID. A new million, a completely different cohort, is what we're seeing. So we are in a process right now of Act Now, Plan Now. We're looking at new commercial revenue streams, and we're looking to recalibrate. You know, this is a time, Josh said, out of crisis comes opportunity, and we are launching different innovative pieces. One of our pillars is innovation. That's the pillar that created the free supermarket. It's the pillar that created a little business called the For Purpose Co., which is a social for-profit business, which looks at trying to create revenue for OzHarvest, because you can't always rely on philanthropy. So we're looking at adding new businesses to that. And literally in the process, we will be rolling out a pilot of a new business called Harvest Bites, together with some of our chefs who can't open their restaurants. We're purchasing food from the providers, the hospitality providers, and creating beautiful meals. At this point, it's only going to be in Sydney as we trial it, but it is a purchasing dinner for two. So many people are trying to do that. We're stuck at home. We can't get out to our restaurants. What if you had a beautiful chef's meal delivered to your home? So we're looking at all the ways we can be as innovative as possible.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, as a follow-up, I suppose, I mean, there's a terrific, robust discussion happening in the chat, but I want to ask you another question. it just seems OzHarvest is so agile. It's sort of incredible. And in a month or 6 weeks, I don't know, you reeled off sort of two initiatives there.
Oh, there are about another 6 I can share with you.
Okay, so right. So we're approaching 10 new initiatives in kind of 6 weeks. So I think people might be wondering sort of how you can, like how you can create an organization or build an organization or sustain an organization that has that ability. So that's probably the first thing. But and you did touch on this, but I'd be remiss in asking you to go into more detail, because I was personally quite affected by the panic buying, sort of on a personal, emotional or intellectual level. And it'd be great just, as a leader in the food space, to get sort of your opinion on the panic buying, but yeah, also how, what are your tips, or what are the 3 things that you could tell us about how OzHarvest has been able to go from like after the bushfires into now sort of launching eight new initiatives?
So I think let's talk about panic buying. And I am quite non-judgmental about panic buying. You have a government, you have a prime minister who says, stock up for the next 2 weeks. We don't know what's going to happen. What do you expect people to do? So on the one hand, obviously, did we need as much toilet paper? Clearly not. We could wrap Australia in toilet paper. Do I believe that at the end, and if there is such a thing as the end, but within a few months, I believe OzHarvest will do a reverse logistics and invite people who bought too much and never used it to give it back, give it to us so that we can deliver it out, because people will be sitting with stocks that I am 100% sure, bags and bags and bags and bags and bags of pasta, many, many cans of chickpeas, not to mention all the other stuff. So I don't judge people. I think, we'd never been in this situation before. I personally never did that because I've never done that in my life, but I think we just have to acknowledge people did that, and it did have a huge effect. And the effect that it had was it opened our eyes to the fact that if there is no surplus food, what do you do? And so, as I said, in the first instance, the government came to our rescue and gave us some money so that we could purchase food while we navigated this journey of finding out where food would come from. So that was the first thing. How do we have an organization? I think if you build an organization that's based on innovation, nobody was rescuing surplus food. That is the bottom line. 16 years ago, nobody was talking about waste. Nobody was talking. So that in itself, that innovation is part of our DNA.
Yes.
Although the fact that there is food waste is the challenge in the first place. So, maybe the innovation is there shouldn't be food waste, but it is another whole subject for discussion. But so I think, through the development of OzHarvest, when we saw that, wow, we had beautiful food that we were taking to people who didn't know how to cook it. Oh, well, the best next thing to do is to create a program to teach those people how to cook with beautiful food. So that was the first of our education pillars, and many of those evolved out of that. So I think what happened here was we put all our emphasis on food relief, given the numbers, given the queues at Centrelink, and given the numbers that were dropping so quickly into this pool of need. And we realized that cooked food, there were many people in isolation, many people who couldn't get shopping, couldn't cook, and some of our charities closed down because they were manned by elderly people, manned by vulnerable people, and it was very scary. So we started producing food, and we're now producing between 5,000 and 10,000 meals a week that are going out to feed vulnerable people.
Incredible.
We then realized that some people can't go shopping, some people can't get their produce, and they can cook at home. So we started creating hampers. So we've created hamper hubs. In Victoria, for example, we will be making about 20,000 food boxes over the next 6 to 8 weeks that will provide a week's worth of food for a family of 4 meals. So beautiful. And those are being delivered out. So, you know, it's that kind of, how do you do that? You do that because you redeploy. We called all our staff. We said some areas, so for example, people in education, there's no education programs being delivered face-to-face. Where we need support is in packing and packaging ready-made food or hampers. And so people have redeployed. And does it take its toll? You better believe it. You know, uncertainty is very frightening for many people. For many, many people. I say for many people, and I don't say for me because I happen to be one of those people who thrive, well, who lives in the present, very much in the present, and all we can control is now. And seriously, if we've learned anything through this period, it's we are not in control, whether we like it or not. You know, COVID came down, landed on us, you know, from Scott Morrison to leaders globally. We are not in control. We are following, and we are, and so for me, living in the present is what we need to do. We need food right now. How are we going to get it to people?
Yeah, I mean, it's shown that, you know, our economy and our society is maybe more fragile than we think. And I think, Ronni, you've probably displayed great skill there because you've made very hard things sound just like a series of realizations. And I'm sure it's much more difficult than that. But maybe there's something that I got out of that is that you're innovating within a space that you understand really well. And so maybe that's what allows you to pivot so easily, which I think is really interesting. I might just throw back to Josh and also sort of tie in a question from another Josh. It's sort of about climate, but I'm not going to ask that directly. But I think, you know, if we think about other crises or whatever crises to come, climate is one of them. We're not going to talk about that too much because that's the third conversation that's happening next week. But, you know, the bureaucracy probably does have like this reputation, for better or for worse, of being a bit slow to respond and a bit sluggish. And you're in opposition now, but you did work for the Premier. So I suppose you have sort of intimate understanding of what it's like to have your hands on the levers of government, and then also to be in opposition. But, you know, this crisis has shown that the government can act quickly. You know, welfare benefits were doubled, and, you know, we've got JobSeeker and JobKeeper. I mean, you know, these things would take years probably to roll out in ordinary circumstances. So, you know, what do you think this means? And you can reference climate if you want, but you don't have to. But what do you think this means in terms of how government works, and how might that have changed? How might Corona might have changed the perception of how government works in terms of dealing with crises, both structurally? You can talk about it at a structural level, but also maybe optically, like perception-wise.
It's a really good question, Gid. I think just as Ronni was sort of talking about the big changes that happen quickly within an organisation, the same thing has happened within government. Greg Hunt did a press conference the other week, and he spoke about how they had a 10-year plan to transition to telehealth Medicare. 10 years. And he said, and we did it in 10 days, as if that's some sort of thing to brag about. The real question is why on earth were you thinking of taking 10 years to transition to telehealth in the first place? And government, I think, especially, I'm going to get a little bit political because I can, especially the coalition government at the moment has not been moving in a particularly hurried pace on any issue. Scott Morrison is a small target politician, and he's probably the most skilled at it that I've seen in a while, probably since Howard. He's a master of it, of making you think he's doing something when he's actually not. And I think that these are huge societal changes, and they've required huge societal responses from government. But really the question is sort of, well, what are we going to go back to, right? What are we going to go back to? Are we going to take away the JobKeeper package and take away the 6 million essentially public servants at the moment, 6 million Australians who are on the public service, who are being paid by the government, and you know, and turn our 10% unemployment that we're currently at into something far more frightening, add 6 million people to the 10% unemployment. I mean, that's a scary, scary prospect. So that's a big question mark. The other big question mark, which you touched on, was the JobSeeker package, which is basically doubling Newstart. I mean, if Corona taught us that we can move government very, very quickly, surely it can teach us also that $40 a day is too small or too little amount for someone to live on. It's the poverty line, and we shouldn't be subjecting people in Australia to the poverty line. And, you know, and despite the fact that Ronni has created something out of nothing and created this huge and found this huge gap in Australian society around food wastage and need, like we shouldn't be having people in Australia needing food and needing food assistance. You know, obviously there are some cases where some people are a bit dislocated and such is life, but on the whole, we have a systemic issue when an organization is, you know, when we need an organization as skilled and as sort of sizable as Ronni's created, it's a huge need, and it's not getting smaller as Ronni has sort of outlined today. So I think there are huge issues and huge lessons to be learned about the pace of government and whether it has consequences for things like climate change, or, you know, I mean, of course it should, and of course we should be moving towards a far more renewable future, and of course we should be moving towards far more sustainable ways of doing business. I don't quite think that's how we're going to sell it. I think we're going to sell it in a way that it's going to be better for jobs and help us get out of the economic recovery, but that's probably something you're going to discuss next week. I think that the COVID crisis, if nothing else, has taught us that the basic standards by which every human being in Australia should be living by: a safe home, enough money for food, and access to healthcare, and, you know, and throw in a bit of education as well in there. But access to a safe home, food, and healthcare are three bare minimums that we should be making sure that government moves as quickly as it needs to in order to guarantee that for people in Australia. And if we don't do that, then we haven't learned anything from this crisis.
You've done well there, Josh, because you've segued into my next question for me, which was for both of you, which was, I mean, you've sort of just said what we've learned from this crisis, but I'm interested to know what you've both learned from this crisis. So maybe, Ronni, could you tell us, you know, what you've, I mean, look, you've been in this game for a long time, obviously, and I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it did feel like you were sort of like born to do this, like with the way that OzHarvest has just sort of so energetically sort of surged into this new phase with all these new initiatives. But you know, could you tell us a little bit about what you've learned from this crisis as well as a leader?
Absolutely. So first of all, that change can happen so fast. It's one thing me running an organization that is innovative in its DNA. But there's absolutely no doubt that we have to learn. What we have to learn from this is that it doesn't have to be like it was before. That if we could rely on science for COVID, we could rely on science for climate change. And we have to demand that. And that the fact that government could see its way clear to looking after doing exactly as Josh has said, job seeker, job keeper, those are not, you know, how could we go back to just looking after our economy? So from my point of view, I think that the same way as we can't go back to providing that same event, our event that was going to happen in March will never happen the way it was set out to, the way that we've done it for the last 9 years. Even in a year and a half, it will be a different event. So too does government, so too do we all have to learn that we have to do things differently. That COVID has shown us that there is, you know, what was is not going to be the same in the future. And so the fact that the economic reasons we've stopped the shutdown, COVID hasn't changed. You know, I mean, yes, we've got less cases, but I went to test this week and they told me there's only a 60% success rate. They can't tell me if it's 60% sure. So those numbers, quite honestly, all we know is COVID is here. And so we've rebuilt and reopening the economy. We have to have learned and do things differently and look after and become a caring community, because we've shown that we can.
Yeah, thanks, Ronni. I mean, I'm personally sort of quite worried that because of all the debt, it's just going to be pivoting back to economy. So that's, I think, maybe a fight that we all have to have, but that feels like a good time to sort of segue to Josh to maybe comment on that, but also ask, what you've learned, working in an MP's office, a lot of vulnerable people might have sort of come out of the woodwork asking for assistance. So I'm sure there's lots of things that you've had to do that are a bit different. So I'd be really keen to hear what you've learned as a politician from this.
There's lots in this, Skid. I think, these things come in waves. So the sort of things that people have presented to us from our office have been really different and sort of evolved. It went from, all the people who needed to access Centrelink for the very first time to people stuck overseas to people wanting to know how to access the JobKeeper and protect their businesses. It's sort of been an evolution as this whole thing's unfolded. But if you sort of park that to one side for a second and you go, all right, it's been a year since the election. Like, who the hell could have predicted the year that we've just had under no circumstances? If you would have told me a year ago, well, Labor's not going to win the election, right? That's the first thing. Labor's not going to win the election. Scott Morrison's going to get re-elected, he's also, after a huge global health pandemic, he's going to go to Hawaii in the bushfires, but I wouldn't have believed that. But anyway, let's move that to the side. Scott Morrison's going to get elected. He's going to do a deal with the Australian Council of Trade Unions to put in a wage subsidy to help people throughout the pandemic. You honestly would have blown me over with a feather. He's going to double the rate of Newstart. He's going to make sure that Medicare and telehealth are available to more Australians, and create an eviction moratorium so that people who can't afford to pay their rent are not going to be kicked out of their homes during a global pandemic. Yet, if you would have told me all of those things, I would have said, mate, stop smoking whatever you are smoking right now, because none of that's going to happen. And it all did. And so, like, things are unpredictable, as Ronni pointed out. This whole year's been unpredictable, and the next year's going to be just as unpredictable. The only thing that I think that is a continuity and a certainty throughout all of this bizarreness that we've unfolded is our sense of humanity and our values of who we are and what do we value as important. And ultimately, this thing has taught us that we can't do this in bits. We all have to be part of this effort to combat the virus, but we all are going to be part of the efforts to get through the next phase as well. And that means bringing people with us. It means looking after people. It means creating a world for people where people aren't being left behind. And I think that this has been an extraordinary year, right? An extraordinary year, but one where, maybe humanity can take a big, deep breath that it desperately needed to amidst all of this tragedy and disaster, especially in some of our places where it's so close to us, and go, well, what's actually important? And that ultimately leads back to our sense of who we are, our humanity, our shared humanity, and the sort of future that we want to build together. And I think that gives us a really rare and wonderful opportunity to be in right now.
And that is leadership. That is what our leaders could actually come out of this COVID with.
Fingers crossed, and that's perfect timing. So there's a very, very robust discussion happening at the same time. I think it was like sort of two things in one. We had both of you talking and a great discussion in the comments. But people are rightly pointing out that there are a lot of other organisations doing really great work in all these areas. So I just want to thank both Ronni and Josh for taking some time out of their days to join us for this conversation. Thank our partner organisations again, and of course everyone else for tuning in and asking questions and being so engaging. Gary has put the link in for the next session. I just want to quickly plug that next link, which will be happening next week, next Monday on the 25th from midday till 1 p.m. It'll be the CEO of Greenpeace, David Ritter, the founder of Small Giants, and the CEO of Small Giants, Danny Almagor, will be having a conversation with Associate Professor Rebecca Forgaz, and it's going to be about what the climate movement has learned from the last few months and how we can apply that moving forward. So if everyone could stick around, there are some breakout rooms now. So what will happen is if you stay on the call, you'll just get put into a room with 5 or 6 other people to have a quick discussion. I did it last time, so I'd really strongly recommend it. So without further ado, that's it. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ronni and Josh, again.